Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Scott Mann Podcast. Super excited about this guest today. Our guest today is a buddy of mine, Dan Jarvis. Let me just read you his bio. It's super impressive. But Dan is the founder of Healing the Hero, Inc., Tactical Resiliency USA, and 22-0. Now, Dan retired from the U.S. Army as a combat infantryman on 9/11/2014, and he was a sergeant first class when he retired. Dan deployed to Iraq, fought there for 15 months, saw a lot of combat from 06 to 07. And then he also deployed to Afghanistan for 12 months, from 2011 to 2012. Dan received multiple blast injuries in Afghanistan while he was fighting the Taliban, and he was also awarded a Purple Heart for the injuries that he sustained in combat against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Dan also served as a drill sergeant for 2 years between both combat tours, and Dan considered suicide after his deployment to Afghanistan in 2013. Now, another thing that Dan has done, I think that makes him uniquely suited for the kind of work that he does around resilience and trauma, is that he served as a deputy sheriff in the state of Florida for almost 7 years. And now he's developing processes that help heal PTSD, depression, anxiety, survivor's guilt, anger, fear, shame, moral injury, and so many more. I mean, really the contributors to the churn that we're always talking about on this podcast. And we're going to go deep on this. I think what you can expect if you've experienced this yourself, and look, this is not exclusive to veterans and first responders. Anybody that has experienced any of those emotions could benefit from the work that Dan and his team do, both in terms of the insights and perspective he's going to give on this podcast, and then the work that could be done with him and his team outside of this podcast. And we're going to cover both next. Can't wait to get started. We'll see you on the other side. Welcome to the Scott Mann Podcast, where we connect like our lives depend on it. All right, Dan, welcome, man. Good to have you with us.
Scott, I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. We've run a lot of miles together, man. I mean, it's I think we kind of connected around early in your transition from the military, or at least into this space that you're in now. And then we kind of split for a while, back together. I think that's kind of how it works in life. But it's really awesome to have you here, man. And I thought, today we're going to cover a lot of ground with the work that you do. But I wonder if we could actually start with, because I just want to give folks kind of a sense of kind of how you roll when it comes to peer-to-peer engagement and the work that you do. You went out to Western North Carolina to lend a hand when Hurricane Helene hit, in that just catastrophic event in the mountains there that just devastated so many lives. And you and Mr. Abel, you went up there, and we'll talk about him in a few. But before we get into your backstory, like just right into it, what did you see when you got into the hills of North Carolina after that terrible hurricane that told you your work was going to be needed?
So we were blessed to go up there, and you guys at Task Force Pineapple significantly helped, and you were the one that made the connection. When Abel and I arrived up there, we didn't know what to expect going into it. Florida here, we're used to hurricanes. I don't think that part of the United States was used to it.
Right.
So we connected with Glenda first.
Yeah, a pastor, by the way, that serves the community where a lot of my relatives and friends live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Glenda was also a former law enforcement officer.
Yeah, that's right.
So
Asheville,
the way we kind of set that up with her is, when we first connected, I said, hey, let me connect you with Tammy, and let's let you do some work so you know what it is that we do. Uh-huh. And then she invited us to come up, and then we went up there. The first time was shortly after the storm, and it's typical destruction. You see trees down everywhere. But the community up there was unbelievable. Like, when you're talking about, people coming together and
paint a picture though of like what you saw. Cause I don't think a lot of people don't understand the magnitude of the damage that happened and how those lives were turned upside down. And
so pretty much trees down all over the place, right? Some buildings were destroyed. We actually went out to one of the fire departments, because we actually went into Asheville and talked to the local fire departments and police departments there, and one of the firefighters says you should probably hit this outlying community they don't really have a lot of resources, and they lost a firefighter. So we drove out there, and some of the roads were not passable. Like part of the interstate, I think it was I-40, was half of it was gone.
Yeah.
And the whole thing was shut down.
Still shut down.
Yeah. And it will probably be shut down for quite a while.
Yeah.
So we got up to the little community, and you could see the water line 5 feet into the tree line, like the mud and so it was every house that we passed, all the contents of their house was in their front yard, and then the people were around talking, and we're like, holy cow. I mean,
these are people that are living one paycheck away from a disaster.
Yep.
When times are good.
Yeah. And it wasn't like an affluent area. It was, middle to lower middle class.
Yeah.
And just to see the level of destruction. And we made our way back down to the fire department, and we met with the local fire chief.
Yeah.
And one of the guys at that agency lost a firefighter the day after the hurricane, trying to rescue somebody in a mudslide. And one of the firefighters, we were just communicating, we're talking, and you could just see the 1,000-yard stare. Something that we see very frequently in the military. And it was a friend of his that had passed. So just human tragedy. That one community, I think, lost around 12, 15 people.
And it was a small community.
Small community, and one family up there, a guy lost like 12 family members.
Yeah, Pastor Glenda told me a story of up on the hilltop where, a guy and his wife lived and their kids, and then his parents. How a lot of mountain communities are, just immediate family, and he got his wife and kids out and went back up towards the high ground to get his mom and dad, and literally watched their house just come down the mountain in a mudslide, and never saw him again.
Wow.
I think about like what that guy must be going through,
Yeah, and the crazy part is when we were up there, it was probably a week or so after the hurricane. They were still looking for people. Yeah,
and they didn't have much help. I mean, the national, state assets really struggled to get up there. So a lot of this was community-based and volunteers, right?
Yeah, it was really interesting to drive down the roads in the communities where they weren't as affected. And, I mean, people were running big barbecues and just giving food away, water.
Yeah.
It was really cool to see the churches come together and kind of consolidating resources to help local residents.
Well, I wanted to paint that picture, Dan, because we're going to come back to it, and we're going to talk a lot about the different areas that you've done your work, your body of work. But I just wanted to start with that because I want people to understand that the type of conversation you and I are going to have today, there's a lot of nonprofits out there. There's a lot of people that do this kind of work. But you and your small organization, you guys go to the heart of the matter. Like wherever there's trauma, wherever there's true suffering, you get in there, you elbow your way in, and you deal directly with peer-to-peer level with what's going on. And I think that's a real important theme on human connection, is this peer-to-peer aspect that you are so big on. So in order to truly appreciate that, though, can you take us, and we're going to come back to Western North Carolina and that piece, among other things, but can you take us through your backstory and your, kind of where you're from, a little bit about yourself, your military career, and what led you to this line of work that you're doing now with helping people overcome trauma and grief and severe emotions?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Scott. So March 2nd, 2013, I found myself looking down the barrel of a rifle. And I had just gotten back from Afghanistan. In my squad, we had 8 Purple Hearts, to include myself, mostly traumatic brain injury related. One of the kids, one of my soldiers was killed, and the grief, the guilt of that, I felt deeply responsible for. And this is after already doing, a deployment to Iraq for 15 months.
You were an infantryman?
I was an infantryman, yep. I served in the United States Army. My career is kind of like, I went into the Army right out of high school. I was 17 years old. It's kind of a funny story, so I'll share it. My dad's career Navy. He's a retired senior chief. So my act of rebellion was to join the Army.
Nice.
Unfortunately, he took it way better than I hoped he would have.
Oh, that's funny.
And I'll never forget, because at 17, I had to have parental permission to go. Right. I can't legally sign a contract. And recruiter comes to the house, and my dad had no clue that I was even talking to the Army recruiter.
Yeah.
So we're like, all right, you can come to the house. It's Saturday or whatever. And he shows up. This is back when they wore their Class B uniforms. And my dad answers the door. Hey, can I help you? Hey, my name is Staff Sergeant Patterson. I'm a recruiter with the United States Army. Your son's wanting to join. Come on in the house. And he was just like beaming, ear to ear, smiling. And we sat down, and he's like, because he's 17, we have to have both your parents' signatures. And it was funny. Yeah, here, he signs it really fast. You know, can I get you a glass of tea? Just being really nice to this guy. And I'm like, this is not the outcome I was hoping for. I was wanting him to be kind of pissed off, right?
Yeah.
And then my mom was handed the contract, and then she started bawling. She's just crying. She's, I don't want him to join the Army. He could get hurt. You know, typical mom stuff. And I don't forget my dad. He goes, shut up, Bonnie, and sign the damn paper. So I always kid around. My mom's DNA is on my enlistment contract. So that was my, welcome to the United States Army. I think 4 weeks after that, I was on a bus to Fort Benning, Georgia. Yeah. And then kind of went. That was 1988. So that was July of 1988. Did 2 years. I did the Army College Fund back when they had the 2-year enlistment, and then they were doing a drawdown, so they were allowing people to do what was called early release, like 90-day drops. So I was like, well, I want to go to school, so I put in a 90-day drop, and then I got out of the Army July 30th of 1990, and then 3 days later, or I think it was the 31st, the last day of July, and then August 2nd, Saddam invaded Kuwait, and nobody knew what Kuwait was back then. Kuwait, Iraq, what is this? It was not even on our radar. And probably about a month after that, in January, I started school. I did a semester, and then in January, I got a Western Union mailgram. It says, you're hereby recalled to active duty. This is your plane ticket. Report to a Delta Airlines, and and you'll fly into Atlanta, and then they'll pick you up in Atlanta. So did it was very short-lived. I mean, I think it was like maybe 6 weeks. That first war was like 100 hours, and it was done. Yeah. And all we were doing was backfilling units. So I got sent to Hawaii, and then I remember it was a Thursday night. They come 2 a.m. All right, you guys get all your stuff. And we literally took everything to supply, dumped it, no accountability. They just threw everything into the supply. And next thing you know, we were on an airplane to the Presidio. We were out processing. We were going home. Wow. That's kind of the path that I took. And after that, I finished up college. I graduated with a degree in criminology and decided I was going to go into law enforcement. So here in Florida, Central Florida, at the Polk County Sheriff's Office in 1996, after I graduated, I started working law enforcement as a deputy sheriff for about a little over 4 years, 4.5 years, and made some life changes at that point. I knew I was carrying some stress, some, things, the job was really just kind of weighing heavy on me. Right. And then when 9/11 hit, and it was less than a year after I got out of law enforcement, I was like, man, what do I do? Do I go back? I was either going to go back to law enforcement or go back in the military. And I didn't even really know that it was an option to go back in the military. Right. Until I ran into a buddy of mine, and he was in the reserves, and then he went active. And I said, hold on, let me just go talk to a recruiter, and went and talked to the recruiter. And he said, yeah, well, we can get you right back in.
It's astounding to me the number of people, it's been 20 plus years since 9/11, the number of people who made that career-changing decision. I mean, there were people already established in their careers. And I don't think folks who were alive or cognizant during that period fully understand. I mean, I definitely have a deeper appreciation now for Pearl Harbor. Yeah. And kind of how that changed the nation's psyche about service. But it really did, didn't it? It was like a tectonic plate shift of service, like of just people joining up from all walks of life, man.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. So I go back to Fort Benning, and then they were trying to figure out what to do because I was prior service, and then they had a warrior transition course that they had just fielded at Fort Knox. So I ended up going to Fort Knox, and they had all prior service, folks. Basically, they were condensing the entire basic combat training into like 4 weeks because we've already been through it. Yeah. And then I went to Fort Knox and ended up going back to Benning because I had to complete the AIT portion. And then I got dropped into week 2 of AIT.
What?
Yeah, I know. It's like the Army's logic. And, so then I'm like, I'm 34 years old. I'm going I just did 4 weeks. Had I just stayed at Fort Benning, I would have been like 2 weeks ahead. So at 34, I'm going back all the way back through basic training.
Oh my God.
AIT. And you got a bunch of 18-year-old kids, 17-year-old kids, 20-year-old kids. And, here I am, prior service.
You're the old man.
I'm the old guy. Yeah. And if I told him, if anybody calls me grandpa, we're taking it to the pit. But it was kind of cool, except for, I got sick and tired of doing push-ups for a bunch of jabronis that were like, oh, you guys, it's so easy, man. Yeah. Of course, they're still developing their brain stems. Yeah. And it was challenging, but it was entertaining to say the least. Yeah, and sure. And it's like because I got put in as the platoon guide at one point because he'll keep in line, and then being prior service, we couldn't house with them. We had to be housed separately. They didn't want us interacting with them outside of the training environment. Excuse me. And so I was in a room with two other guys. We were kind of like, we had our own little room set up, and we didn't have to do all the after dinner chow stuff.
Well, at least that.
So but still you're locked down and
So where'd they take you from there?
Well, I had selected to go back to Hawaii, so I re-enlisted to go to Hawaii because I really enjoyed Hawaii the first time. Yeah. So
25th.
Yeah, 25th Infantry
Division. Yeah.
So and I got to go back to be a Wolfhound again. So the Wolfhounds was the unit I was with when I was there the first time, which is a huge history.
Very storied unit.
Oh, very storied unit. And so I get there, and I'm still an older guy. I went back in as an E4 because of college or whatever. And the sergeant major there was talking to me, and he's like, "Oh, I can have an adult conversation with this guy." Yeah. He's like, "Jarvis, I'm gonna make you my driver." And I'm like, oh, it's not really why I came back in. Yeah. But I got promoted relatively quickly, and as soon as I made E5, I asked the sergeant major. I said, Sergeant major, I really came back because I want to go fight. Yeah. And I said, could I go to the line? So he's like, yeah, I'll let you. So I went to Alpha Company 227 Infantry, and rolled right into a deployment. They had, when I got to Hawaii, they were still in Afghanistan, and they were returning. I think I was in Hawaii for about 3 months on rear detachment. They came back.
What year was this about?
2005.
Yeah. I actually was in Afghanistan with the 25th. Yeah.
They were in Paktia province.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. There were some other elements in other parts of the country, but yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So it was, and it was kind of interesting because here you are, you're the older, E4, and you're back into a regular unit, and having to live in the barracks, which was like, and then finally when I got E5, I was able to move out and live in Eva Beach. And then we were getting ready to go when we did the NTC rotation, and next thing you know, we're boots on the ground in Kuwait first, August 6th of 2006. Yeah. And I'll never forget my platoon sergeant had already deployed, and he's telling everybody, so I can't tell you what it's going to be like. You're going to have to feel it for yourself, but it's going to be hot, right? And we don't know what hot is until you get off the airplane in Kuwait, and it was probably about 140 degrees with like a 10-mile-an-hour wind, and it's like, holy cow, you know. And then it was acclimation, and to the Kuwait, and then we went into Iraq after that. Right. So we got sent to a battalion-sized FOB called FOB McHenry, and it was just an infantry unit, and we were just doing operations in Hawija, and it was a pretty difficult deployment too. We lost 18 guys on that deployment. Wow. Mostly IEDs, and one of our Humvees got hit, and it was a catastrophic kill. 5 guys were killed in one IED blast. A lot of indirect fire, and then we had direct fire engagements as well. So it was interesting.
You came back from that deployment. What was that like for you, as far as like how did that evolve you as a soldier, an NCO, a leader, a human?
Well, it was an eye opener to the reality of the world that we now lived in. Yeah. Most people don't understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of a two-way range, right? Yeah. a lot of guys struggled after that deployment because we got extended. We did the 15-month tour.
Right. Yeah.
And they literally shut the light off. We were expecting 10th Mountain to come in and rip out with us.
Yeah.
In like 3 weeks.
That's a kick in the nuts there, isn't it? When you...
I remember we had an MWR room set up, and some guy gets up and goes, "What the?" And Yahoo News broke it, and command didn't even. So they shut the MWR down, sent everybody back to their units, called in all of the commanders, and then they briefed the lieutenants and the first sergeant and the platoon sergeants, and then that's when we got the word that we're staying another 90 days, which really was hard because, you're already in a pretty kinetic fight, and you've been doing it for 12 weeks.
And your mindset is kind of geared towards that rotation home. You've already kind of started programming yourself for that.
Yeah, you're starting to drop the guard towards the end. You're like, okay, there's light at the end of the tunnel. It's going to be all right. And we had guys that were stop lost who didn't make it home.
Wow.
Guys that were killed in that window
of that 90 days.
Wow. And just, it's like you do what you have to. As a soldier, we all sign up for it, and they got you by the short hairs for those 8 years, whether you're at the 4-year mark or whatever.
Take us to Afghanistan. Your next, like, what? How did it keep evolving for you towards this thing that you do today?
When we were on our post-deployment leave from Iraq, my platoon sergeant calls me and says, "Hey, you might want to check your AKO, which is your Army Knowledge Online. You came down on orders." And I'm like, "What do you mean I came down on orders?" I re-enlisted to stay with the Wolfhounds because I wanted to go back to Iraq. They were going back 12 months later, and came down on orders for drill sergeant. So that was a massive interruption to what my plans were, because I just wanted to go fight. And however, I will say this: being a drill sergeant made me a much better NCO. Learning to be so precise with those skill level 1, skill level 2, made me a much better NCO in teaching and mentoring younger soldiers.
Would you say that it also informed what you're doing today in a lot of ways with the kind of the peer-to-peer stuff? And
So, as a drill, I mean, you're getting kids right off the bus with no training. I mean, they're just straight civilians, and you got to smash the civilian out of them. But you're still mentoring these kids. You're training these kids to go fight, right? You have an enormous responsibility, because like one of the things that I used to do is every week when the Army Times would come out and they'd list all of the soldiers that died, I would read off the names of everybody every week, so that they could see the reality of what they're getting into. And take their training significantly more seriously. But it was. I wish I'd had the skills that I have now. Then we'd had probably the most motivated group of guys on the planet. And then after that, I came down on orders to go to Alaska. That was kind of self-inflicted. My roommate in drill sergeant school was in Alaska, but he was at the Anchorage side of Alaska. So he was in the airborne unit, and when I saw the Alaska was open, I selected it, and so I called him up. His name was Scott. I said, "Scott, hey man, I'm going to Alaska." And he goes, "Oh yeah, you're going to Richardson?" I said, "No, it's a place called Fort Wainwright." He goes, "Why the hell are you going to Wainwright?" I'm like, "What do you mean, why the hell am I going to Wainwright?" And
how many conversations in the Army have gone that way?
Oh my gosh! And it of course it was Coors Light that was the instigator. I had a roommate at the time. We were watching football one of the Sundays I had off. We both saw it popped up, and we both picked Alaska.
Coors Light had its way with me on numerous occasions in the Army.
Man, I'll tell you what, worst decision ever. But in reality, it was probably one of the best decisions too.
How is that?
It's kind of what's leading me to where I am right now. Deployed to, it was April of 2011 is when we hit Kandahar Airfield. We flew into Al Salim, and then we went over to Kandahar, and then did a little bit of train up in Kandahar before we got sent to our FOB, which was in the Shah Joy district in Zabul province, and it was called FOB Bullard, and two totally different military units. 27th Infantry Regiment versus the 24th. Great command elements at the 24th, but when we got into FOB Bullard, I'm anticipating a proper rip out with these guys.
Relief in place.
So we get 30 minutes with an E6.
Oh wow, that's all you got.
That's all
on
we
their
got.
way out the door.
On their way out, they were already gone. Basically,
Wow, they're already loaded up.
they're already loaded
palletized.
up, palletized. They're out.
What year was this?
This was 2011.
Got it. Okay.
So we get into the fob, and I'm like, "This is all we get is 30 minutes."
Yeah.
And he says, "There's nothing happens here, right? This is it's pretty, which just meant that unit didn't do a lot of operations. They just kind of stayed internal to the fob." And our commanders had different ideas. They're going to get out into the community. They're going to make their presence known. And then we're also coming into the first unit rotating in with the new multicam uniforms. So like the whole community thought we were like special forces, and we were just regular infantry guys. And as we started pushing further and further out, then we started, receiving fire.
Contact, yeah.
Right. And most of the fire that we received was indirect or IEDs. Very, very, very few direct fire engagements because you're a way standoff distance is way higher and less urban than Iraq was. And I'll never forget the night that we took our first contact. What it was in March, and we're having a leadership meeting. I now know exactly what happened. We're in a leadership meeting, and I heard a thump in the distance, and that's when the spidey hairs on your back of your neck stand up. And I looked at the whole group. I said, "We're about to take contact." And they looked at me like I was crazy because a lot of these guys had never deployed.
Yeah.
But that was the exact same sound that I heard at the end of my deployment to Iraq.
Right.
Where I almost got blasted by a 122 millimeter artillery round.
Right.
It literally impacted on top of a HESCO wall. But when I heard that thump in the distance, like all the hairs on my head in the back of my neck just kind of stand up.
Yeah.
And that's when I said, we're about to take contact. And they're like, "What? How do you figure?" And then literally by the time one guy says, "How do you figure?" rounds impacted about 20 meters from us.
Wow.
And that's where we took our first casualties. So we had where that was next to what we call our Joe tent. We were in the leadership tent. Joe tent was right next to it. So we got tents on the other side too. So we got to get accountability. So me, my platoon sergeant, and another squad leader, we're moving to the Joe tent, and a round air bursts, like literally like 10 feet over our heads. And all three of us impact the ground at the same time, just from the overpressure. And then we got in, had to treat the casualties. And my platoon sergeant says, "Jarvis, go get accountability of everybody." So we had a bunker that we'd all go to, and we'd have to get our status on our guys. And one of my guys got medevaced, and one of the other squads got medevaced out. My guy didn't return to theater after that. He took shrapnel to the hip, to the face, lost a little bit of vision in one of his eyes. He was later medically retired. But that was our wake up call, and that's when we really you're looking at from a leadership perspective. We didn't even do a proper assessment of our fob. Like we just received it and left it as it was.
Yeah, just rolled in on it.
And then we realized, wow, if those HESCO walls around the Joe tent had been full, those casualties would have never been taken.
Right.
So then we just, at that point, it was force protection. We were building up the fob, and there was HESCOs on the exterior that weren't even full.
Right.
And so we were moving earth, best we could to fill, all the HESCOs up to the top.
The age-old story of Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires.
And I'll tell you what, man, that Afghanistan was so different than Iraq.
Yeah.
I mean, way different culturally, way different operationally. But that was kind of the very introduction to fighting, and it was a group of, there was 2 or 3 guys that had an 82 millimeter recoilless rifle. So they were firing it in an indirect mode, and it's a direct fire weapon. It's like an anti-armor, and these guys were really good. They were really, and we shared a fob with the Romanians, and the Romanians had a church with a little steeple and a cross on the top. So that's probably what they were trying to impact. But
not to mention the fact they rolled around in Soviet-era BMP vehicles, which didn't help matters either. So let me ask you, and because I want to dive into the work you do now. Can you talk a bit about the kind of the day that everything changed for you in Afghanistan with your squad, kind of what you went through there, and then how did all that evolve into bringing us back to the beginning with looking at that barrel.
Mm-hmm. So if we're starting to move forward, in July of 2011, I was leading a patrol across the Tarnak River. I had 4 Afghans and I had 4 Americans and 1 interpreter. And it was the first mission we'd ever done without an interpreter. And it's like 1 o'clock in the morning and we had to go back to our strikers. We were doing a 4-day op on top of a mountain and then assessing patterns of life. But the Afghan counterpart didn't have, they wouldn't eat our MREs because they weren't kosher.
Right.
So we had to do a mission after the first night where we basically were moving back to the strikers, linking up, picking up the halal meals, But that night we were getting ready to move off the mountain. I had my guys ready, and you could hear machine gun fire in the distance. I'm like, oh, this is going to be lovely, right? Got a brand new interpreter who I didn't know or trust, and he ended up being amazing. It was awesome. He's actually here in the U.S. now. We started moving down off the mountain, and we were getting ready to cross over the Tarnak River, and that's when I stepped on a pressure plate, which detonated an IED that was probably maybe 5 to 10 feet away. And it looked like a match went off, like a fireball went straight up into the sky, and then all the overpressure came out, and then you're picking yourself up off the ground and trying to make sense of what's going on, and then I called out status to try to find out, and I had one guy that hadn't answered yet, and it was very dark. Nods weren't even really that effective because there was like no starlight, nothing.
Yeah, nothing.
And then finally we got the up, and I just said, told one of my guys, I said, we picked the crappiest terrain we could find. I said take that point by force, let's get off the X, and then we'll regroup. So we literally just picked the shittiest area that we could find because that's the least likely of secondaries. And then we set up a perimeter, and my bell was rung. I was like, my ears are ringing. I'm starting to get nauseous. I'm dizzy, having a hard time balancing. Can't even read a GPS. Right. And I'm trying to call out on the radio because I didn't want anybody to come back down the mountain because I didn't know what the secondaries were. We were just going to try to link up with the strikers, and then I just realized
secondaries in this case being ambushes and explosives that are set up to anticipate where you move to or how the response happens, and then they hit you again.
Yeah,
in depth.
Yeah. So had the perimeter set up. I'm calling out, and I can't transmit out, but I can hear the comms. And then when I looked down at my emitter, my antenna had snapped, so I lost my antenna. So I could hear them. I just couldn't push out to them.
Right.
And then I had a fister with me, a forward operator. I said, call him up, tell him to stay put, not to come down the mountain. And he's calling up, and he can't get him either. And he brought a short whip antenna. I'm like, seriously? You're a fister in the mountains, and you bring a short. I wanted to. Whew. Anyways, the NCO came out of me in that conversation. So then we just held perimeter because the only thing we do is hold security. We got IR strobes, so they end up coming down and they find us. And my lieutenant, great guy. God's sense of humor. I'm an infantry guy. And I go to a striker unit, so I get put in the MGS platoon. That's the main gun system. Mm-hmm. So I'm working with a bunch of armor guys now, but he was a really good dude. He's like, okay, you guys are good. Go back to the trucks, link up, get the food, and then meet us back on the mountain. And I'm like, sir, no offense and no disrespect, I can't even tell you what day of the week it is. So they had the medic with them. The medic looked at everybody and said, they're done. All of them have TBI symptoms, and because we're all in a Ranger file when we got hit. And so we went back to the strikers and just kind of stayed put. They had to go back up the mountain. It ended the operation at that point. Yeah. Couldn't get any air assets. Wow. So we had a CASEVAC out. We couldn't medevac out. And got back to the FOB and went and saw our battalion surgeon, Doc Greenberg. Awesome dude. We were lucky to have a surgeon with us. Yeah. An actual surgeon. And it's funny because in Iraq, we had an OBGYN for an infantry unit. Wow. And the running joke in Iraq was the battalion surgeon or the battalion doctor had more confirmed kills than anybody on the unit. But Major Greenberg, if you got into him, a lot of guys came in, even Afghans would come in and man, he'd square him away and then we'd get him out. They even had some civilians come up and he said, yeah, bring him in. Wow. Right. Which is uncommon. Yeah. But he was a good dude. And he's like, Sergeant Jarvis, you're done for the next 7 days. I'm like, what are you talking about? You're off the battle roster for 7 days. And that didn't go well with me.
Yeah.
You're an NCO and you're leading guys.
Yeah.
And then your guys are going out and doing missions, and I'm now trusting, another NCO to lead my guys. And then, of course, I'm glued to the emitter. I'm listening to all the traffic. You know, and then they took some, one of the Afghan police guys they were with got blown up with an IED, and I hear it, and then I'm listening to the radio traffic, and I'm just so frustrated. And then I told Lieutenant Causey, I said, sir, please go talk to the surgeon. Tell him to get me back on the battle roster. So he wanted me on the roster, because I was his senior E6. So he goes, talks to the battalion surgeon, and the battalion surgeon comes back, talk to him, and he says, hey, Sergeant Jarvis, the surgeon says if you get blasted again, it could kill you. And I'm like, okay, fine. Yeah. So I just kind of stayed off the roster for 7 days. But the problem that I was having at that point is every time I would close my eyes to sleep, I would hear an explosion.
Yeah.
Right. So literally I'd be drifting off, and then it was boom. Right. First couple times that happened, I'm like putting gear on, and then you realize there's nobody else responding or reacting. What's going on? Just so I was pretty much a zombie pretty much for the rest of that deployment. And then August 19th, 2011, the Romanians had refused a mission, and we had just come back from a 7 days at a patrol base. So we were down. We're supposed to be down for at least 24 hours, and our guys just got cleaned up, and everybody just laid down. And then they came in, tasked us to go, exploit an IED that one of the other platoons had found. And I remember the briefing, everything. We're all there as a group, and we're SPing, and we brought the MGS with us, which is it's a Striker with a 105 millimeter howitzer. It looks like a tank with 8 wheels. And we get to a point where we stop. We were originally going to walk on foot because we had to go onto a black route, which means it hadn't been cleared.
Yeah.
And the decision was made to move the Strikers in, but we had actually just fielded the very first double V-hull Strikers in Iraq, and we also took the very first IED strike on a double V-hull Striker. I don't know who the engineer is for General Dynamics, but that dude should get a raise. But the MGS was still a flat bottom.
So the V was basically just configured to withstand the damage from an IED more effectively than
so when an IED hits a flat bottom vehicle, there's nowhere for the pressure to go but straight up into the vehicle.
Right.
So the double V hole, it's not like you can't really see it as a V, but it's made in sections where it's got areas for the energy to dissipate.
Gotcha.
So the round hits underneath it, and it'll dissipate out the sides and the back of the Striker. So when our first guy hit it, their feet are off the ground. They have like a little stirrups for them. He said it was like a roller coaster ride. It's the seats hanging from the ceiling, and the vehicle would just shake until all the energy is dissipated, and then everybody's fine. The MGS didn't have that, and we had a mine roller on ours, and I remember the route was very compacted. We didn't see any disturbed earth.
Right.
And we had mine rollers, and I remember we went through a wadi, and the mine rollers putting pressure on the ground, and then everybody's like literally driving in the wheels, the wheel well, where the tires are for the vehicles in front of them. And then I'll never forget, as we were going down it, I said, well, boys, we're still amongst the living. And my driver goes, Sergeant Jarvis, that's messed up. I said, hey, man, you just got to have fun out here. And then not too long after that, I heard the detonation behind me. And that's when the MGS got hit. And originally the call came out that everybody was okay because he sent up a green flag because you kill the power so that the fuel doesn't dissipate. And then the request came in for a medevac. And that's when we knew that there was something wrong. So we had perimeter set up. We had security set up. And the medic had to come from the back of the convoy up. And they're just slowly moving with a mine roller. And I look back. So we had an EOD element with us. Man, those guys are rock stars.
Yeah.
They're sweeping rapidly all the way back to the medic.
And Holly, our Gold Star mom in the play, her son Danny was EOD.
Yeah.
And when she lost him in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Same year.
Yep. The thing is, those guys moved so quickly to get back, and then got the medic up sooner, and then it was at 9:36 they reported that we lost Cordo. So we had medevac coming in. The other two in the vehicle were two of my soldiers, had to get medevaced. One of them came back to us, and one of them, that was the end of his deployment because he got hit pretty good. And that was like, I remember pounding my hand on my striker. I was so angry at myself.
Yeah.
Because it's like, how did I miss it? You know?
Yeah.
And then we set up the perimeter, and then we're on our way back out. And one of the other lieutenant that came out to get us said, "Hey, it sounds like the EWO system the Duke system is jamming a signal." And then his interpreter was listening to the ICOM and said, "Hey, there's ICOM chatter that they're trying to hit another vehicle." And then as they're pulling out the MGS, it got hit a second time. So it's literally like 70 meters in front of me, and I just see this explosion, and then the tires on them things are huge, and I see one of the tires flying probably 150 yards through the air. So it's just a lot of force.
Yeah.
Luckily, the guys that were towing it were fine, but being that it looked like a tank, it's the most catastrophic weapon that we have, so they targeted it. So they hit it twice. And then when we got back to the fob, just the look on everybody's, it was just, you get that like, you don't expect loss like that. It was pretty gut wrenching to see how it was impacting all the kids, and the survivor guilt is a real thing.
It sure as hell is.
It
follows you home too.
Yeah.
You know, you don't get to leave that one even when you take off the uniform, and it follows you everywhere you go if you're not careful.
Yeah. It's an 800-pound gorilla. Yeah. Just like PTSD is.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I had more issue with survivor guilt than anything, and still do. You know, I still have my moments with it, but I know exactly what you're talking about with that. Yeah.
As we're getting ready to close out, we had a running joke on our fob. Anytime the chaplain came around, somebody got hurt or killed. And I remember at the very end of our deployment, I see the chaplain on the fob. I'm like, oh boy, who's going to get it now? And that night, I got a Red Cross notice. And that's when I found out my mom had a massive heart attack.
Wow.
So I was torn because we had 3 weeks left, and I didn't want to leave my guys. And then fortunately, my first sergeant was pretty hard-headed, and he's like, well, I'm going to make that choice for you. We don't need you anymore. You're going home. So then I started that. You know, the next day I had to get everything ready and packed up, and, you know, get all my, you know, stuff taken care of, because they were going to have to, you know, log it out after that. And then I went to Kandahar, and I'm just standing by Kandahar waiting for flights into Kuwait. And, you know, I would call home, and I remember talking to my dad, and he's an emotional wreck. Mm-hmm. You know, he's like, I've never seen my dad. He's a senior chief, retired bailiff, you know, just a hard-nosed guy. And he's like, you need to hurry up. I don't know how long she can hold on. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, it's like a gut punch. And I remember after that, as soon as I got done off the phone with him, I went to the gym, and I just hit a treadmill for 2 hours, and I just ran as hard as I could for 2 hours just to get some of that energy out of me. And then I realized, all right, I went back and I called my dad back. I said, look, Dad, you've been married to Mom for a lot longer than I've been around. Whatever decision you make, I will support it, but do not make me be a reason she suffers. Yeah. And then I hung up, and then it was like, oh, Dad, I just told my dad it was okay to pull the plug. That one still gets me emotional because I never did get to say goodbye. But so that I went back, I got back, you know, hoping to see her, and I went straight to the hospital. I didn't have a cell phone, I had no way to call anybody, and go to the hospital, and I tell the guy at the front desk, and I said, I'm here to see my mom, and I gave him my mom's name, and he just had this look on his face, and I knew what that meant. I said, it's okay, it's not your fault. Went home, and of course the family was already there, and then we buried her, and that was hard. I think that was the catalyst that really kind of locked everything in for me. Right. Just utter loss, right? Yeah. And missing those years. Yeah. And then after that, I still had orders to go back. I could have, and they're like, you need to come back to Alaska. And I said, I'm not going back to Alaska. I'm going back to Afghanistan. I still had time. They still had like 2 weeks left, and then they cut orders really quick, and cancel my other orders because I was ready just to go back.
Yeah.
And so I get back to back to Alaska, and I'm not sleeping, mind you, from July, and we're in February, the end of February, and I'm not sleeping. First thing I do when I get back to Alaska is I went to the Class 6, which is like a liquor store on base, and got a case of beer, and I passed out that night.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I got this. I can do this. And that really became my rhythm. Battle rhythm was just to drink to the point where I actually had it timed because you can't drink 8 hours before a shift. Right? So I'd make sure I was done drinking so I could sleep through the night and get up and go to work.
Wow. Maintenance drinking. To the highest level.
Yep. To the point where you have it down to a science.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm just going to be passed out by this time.
Yeah. Until you don't.
Until you don't. Right. And then, but we got back. I'm still on the line. I'm doing okay because we're hitting ranges. We're training. And then I got notice that I was going to be moved up to the 3 shop because I was a senior E6 in the battalion. Yeah. And they're like, you got to get your staff time in. So I ended up going up to the 3 shop, which is operations. And I became a school's NCO. And I'm like, now I'm riding a desk. Yeah. And now I'm in my head. Yeah. All day long.
Got time to think about all that shit.
Like I would stay at work as long as I possibly could. Usually the sergeant major would kick me out because he's the last guy to leave. He would call me Cookie because of remember the old Cookie Crisp cereal back in the 80s? Because we're about the same age. He's like, Cookie, sergeant major, go home. Roger, sergeant major. So I just pulled my cat card out and that was my cue to leave. And then I'd, hit my time right and then sleep. Yeah, get up and do it all over again. But yeah, it was crazy because I had to have a surgery on my shoulder post deployment. Yeah, and had one surgery 1 year, and I had to do the other one the next year. When I had to do the next surgery, I knew it was a flip of the coin. It was that 2014 drawdown. Yeah, and they're trying to get numbers, and I'm like, oh, I have to have this surgery done because my shoulder was inflamed all the time. Like my shoulder was hot to the touch. And went in and did surgery. And right after that surgery, they're like, MEB, Medical Evaluation Board. And I was an E6 promotable at the time. Yeah. So I was getting ready to pick up E7 and go get a platoon. So I was going to get back on the line, which is what I wanted to do. And then I got stuck in the drawdown and then waiting on the VA. And that was like 12 to 14 months of like, what's going on? Like they were so backlogged. You're just in a holding pattern. And then I was like, getting ready to finally clear out. And then I'm clearing our medical. And then the PA's like, well, what did you do for your TBI stuff? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, what kind of TBI work have you done? Because it was documented more than one TBI.
Yeah. Traumatic brain injury for those of you that don't know.
Yeah. And then he's like, I may have to flag your retirement. I'm like, oh, please, doc. I said, don't do that. I'm so ready to start the next chapter. Yeah. And then he says, well, you got to promise me you'll go to the VA as soon as you get home. And I'm like, deal. Right. And I held my end of the bargain. As soon as I got retired, I went back to the VA and then to get evaluated for TBI. And I'll never forget, you're talking about wanting to throat punch a doctor. The VA doctor looks at me and goes, well, what's a big deal? It's just a concussion. Wow. Yeah. And he's like 28 years old. Wow. He's probably not even been a doctor all of, 6 months, and then, because then the VA started to become very triggering for me. Yeah. But I traded one uniform in for another.
Was now the period of time where you were looking down the barrel of that rifle, was that in Alaska or was that?
That was in Alaska. That was, 11 months post-deployment. Yeah. I was friends on Facebook with Doug's mom, and Doug's mom, Doug was her only child. Yeah. And every time I would see her post something, it was just like a dagger.
Gutting.
Oh, it was like, because you felt responsible.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
You're like, if I'd done this, if I'd have done that. Yep. I second guessed me because when I got blasted, I should have said, hey, man, somebody else probably should be point. All the woulda, shoulda, coulda. And so we end up absorbing that level of guilt and responsibility. Yeah. Had I said something sooner, if I'd had enough courage to say, I'm struggling here, would, would it have had a different outcome? And I'll never know,
Yeah.
But it got to the point, actually go back to the deployment at the very end in September, at the end of the fighting season. One of my other soldiers, they were doing a little detail on the HLZ, the helicopter landing zone. And then we took more indirect, and he was standing 4 feet from impact.
Wow.
And shrapnel literally went through his chest. You could see his heart beating through his chest. And his name was Donnie Esslinger. And Donnie he was our radio operator. And, I remember everybody getting kits up, and I'm up on the top of one of the towers. We're looking for targets. And the striker had the gun disassembled on the HLZ because we were doing maintenance. And he said, "You want me to get the gun up?" I said, "Absolutely, get the gun up." And so he got the gun up, and he found a heat signature that was a ways out. And we had one of those radar units on the fob. So we hit the coordinates for where he was, and that was within like 20 feet. Like, that's our point of origin. And I called up a polar fire mission, which was very quickly denied. And it was probably about three clicks out.
Yeah.
And I just told the gunner, I said, "Do you got eyes on the target?" "Roger." I said, "What's the distance?" So basically we're doing plunging fire.
Yeah.
So I said, "Open up on the target with a 50 cal." It was the only time that whole deployment that we returned fire from inside the fob.
Wow.
And our commander was holding a key leader engagement with the elders, and they're literally moving back to the fob because of the contact. And I'm on the tower, and the 50 cal is literally shooting 15 meters away from me and just past him. He's probably not the smartest thing I've ever done, but I tell you what, though, it was one time that the kids felt like they got to fight back.
Yeah.
So
let's take it into, you come home. We didn't. So talk to me about that night when you thought about checking out.
Yeah. I knew that I was having problems because I'd have such horrible nightmares and night sweats. Like, I'd wake up drenched, you know, because it's like you're doing cardio in your sleep, because you're doing cardio when you're asleep. And heart would be racing 150, 160 beats a minute, when those dreams hit.
Yeah.
And that night, I'm like, you know what? I'm not married. I got no kids. Wouldn't take but a second and the pain would be done. Right. Didn't want to die because I thought about options. I mean, do I self-refer? Well, if I do that, the command, are they going to respect me? Are my men going to respect me? And I'm like, the suicide seemed like a viable option, being on active duty, because of culture, right?
Yeah.
We're grunts, we're infantry guys, suck it up, buttercup, rub some dirt on it, you take a knee, drink water, whatever you want to say, and I was that guy after Iraq. I was that hard-headed NCO that just didn't fully understand the brain.
Yeah.
And I was looking at that rifle, and thank God I heard the kids in the apartment above me running across my ceiling, and it took me out of that moment. I'm like, the last thing I want to do is put a high-powered round through a floor. Yeah. So I'm like, all right, we'll just go business. I'll do it somewhere else. I'll do it off base, out in the woods somewhere. Nobody will even know. Passed out that night, and then I get a phone call the next morning. It was Ryan, who was my driver and one of my soldiers in Afghanistan. He said, "Sergeant Jarvis, did you hear about Corey?" You and I both know when that question's asked, it's not good. Either somebody's dead or in jail. And I said, "No, buddy, what happened?" He goes, "He shot and killed himself last night." So that same night I was thinking about checking out, Corey actually killed himself.
And you think of what that would have done to your guys.
Yeah, well, that was I remember burying my head in my hands. I was like, man, this was a happy kid. He's always helping everybody else out. How do we miss it? He was a husband. He was a dad. And then I realized nobody had a clue that I was struggling. Right. Nobody.
Right.
I mean, not a not a single person.
I didn't even tell my wife. I was in a very similar spot, and it was an interruption in the house that pulled me off of it in 2015. I didn't even tell my wife until 2019.
Wow. I get it. It's that whole, it's the stigma that's attached to struggle.
So you come home and you switch one uniform for another, back into law enforcement?
I went back into law enforcement. Polk County.
Yeah.
So, and I hadn't even thought about going back into law enforcement, but Donnie Esslinger, my soldier that was wounded, his dad was the Seminole County Sheriff in Florida.
Okay.
So I got to meet him when we did our final hoorah, that we did a battalion ball, and Gold Star families came up, and Wounded Warriors came back, and we just kind of celebrated one last time. And he's like, because I was his chaperone, basically, his liaison, because it just made sense. And we connected, and he was like, Danny, you ever think about going back being deputy again? Because he wanted me to come work for him. Yeah. Right. And I never thought about it, but that seed got planted, and I said, you know what, I could do that. Right. I've already got, 4.5 years on the job. And so I ended up coming home and went to the academy. And, life's still happening, right? And while I was in the academy, everything was going good. We're busy, we're engaged, we're studying, we're shooting on the ranges, we're doing combatives, we're doing all the things that keep the brain active. And then I put the uniform back on, I got sworn back in, and I'm a deputy sheriff again. And something weird happened. I felt normal, right? People don't realize first responders operate in the fight or flight every day. Their whole job is fight or flight. Your head's on a swivel. You're looking at people's hands. You're sitting with your back to the wall when you eat out. You're looking at the exits. You're seeing who's coming in. So your brain is constantly and that,
scanning all the time.
Yeah. And that feels normal to somebody with PTS.
Right.
Because that's the response that the brain operates in.
Yeah.
I no longer felt like a fish out of water. Right. And I did that. I did law enforcement for another 2 years. And I had spinal stenosis issues. So duty belt was crushing my sciatic nerve to the point where my last 6 months, I'm literally having to lift my leg into the car. Yeah. And I talked to my ex-wife, and she's like, well, you're already vested in the Florida retirement system. So in about 6 months, I get to collect another pension from the state. So,
Well, it was about that time that Gwinnell and I met, and I was teaching a course at the Polk County Sheriff's Department, and she actually walked out into the parking lot with me, and she was, I could tell something was up, and she talked about you, and could we connect? And we think we went to dinner, and then you ended up coming to one of our leadership events, way out in the boonies, and let's talk about that for a second, because I think that's, when you talk about human connection, right? Because you just never know. You run these races and these journeys, and then you connect. Connections happen at the most unforeseen, unlikely places.
Well, and not only that, but what offshoots from those connections is incredible. Yeah. I'll never forget, Gwinnell told me about, hey, we're going to go out to dinner with Scott and Monty, and I'm like, who's Scott, right? And he's a retired Lieutenant Colonel, Green Beret, and I'm like, oh, great. He's on the dark side, what you would call officers. And we go out to dinner. And of course, it's like the trying to get to know each other, and it's the proverbial butt sniffing. And it's like, oh, this guy's cool. I can dig it. And then you invited me to do the Spartans Rising event. And you want to talk about a moment. You were doing a training. You were talking to the whole group. There's probably, 30 guys there? 40? Yeah. So it was a good group of guys. And you're doing it, you're teaching, and then you stopped, and you looked at me. He says, Dan, because I must have had a look on my face. Yeah, you did. You're like, Dan, you look like you have something you want to say. And that's when I said 22-0. Yeah. And you're like, what's that? I said, we're losing 22 vets a day to suicide. We're going to take it to 0. Had no clue how that was going to happen. Yep. But the connection points from that group led to some very profound paradigm shifts.
Sure did, and you moved fast. Yeah. One of the things that I always talk about is when we deal, and we do a lot of work with first responders and combat veterans and families of the fallen, and it's in that grief and in that narrative work, and we're not talking about exposure therapy. I'm talking about true storytelling, like the 1,000-year-old system of where you go, and because it's a sense-making tool. And I feel like, as I look back on it now, you were going through the storytelling work, and Dr. Joan Rosenberg says that stories heal the brain, they align the hemispheres and help us make sense of things that don't make sense. And I feel like the work that you did out there, you didn't know the how yet, but you certainly arrived at the why. Yeah. And it through that story work, and I think sometimes that's the hardest part.
Well, for me, I found out my why was to find a better way and to share it. Yeah. Right. That really became, because I was looking for me, right? Initially, it was like, how do I help Dan? How do I put my oxygen mask on? Yeah. Right. Yeah. And not fully understanding. We initially started the organization to connect veterans and first responders to like therapists, because that was
It was
the
like
world.
a catalyst
Right.
organization.
That was kind of the world we lived in.
Yeah.
And then 6 months after I started 22-0, I was invited to Albuquerque, New Mexico, Tom Padilla, and met Dr. Burke, and I'm the cop sitting in the back of the classroom, and that was like a 4-day training. It was the RTM protocol.
Yeah, reconsolidation of traumatic memory.
Yeah, reconsolidation of traumatic memories protocol. And of course, cops, we don't trust anybody, right?
Right.
And I'm like, man, these guys are nuts. It's crazy. So I remember day 2, Alan was the lead trainer. He was from Canada, and I'm like, dude, you guys are making some very, very big claims, because I'm looking for ways to help myself.
Like, what kind of claims were they making?
That PTSD can heal within 3 to 5 sessions.
Yeah, and they're also saying that you could take the D off of it.
Right.
And then it's not a disorder,
Right.
that it's an injury.
It's an injury, right? So anyways, we're
And this was like 2000, I'm sorry, but it was 18.
Yeah. April of 18 is when we met.
That's right.
And then this was September of 18.
Okay.
So I'm like, look, I'm calling BS with this guy. I'm like, if I'm going to recommend this to anybody, I want to feel it.
Yeah.
And he's like, you want to do it today? I'm like, heck yeah, sooner the better. He goes, you want to do it when we come off break in front of class? And I'm like, I'm about to show 25 mental health professionals how much of an idiot this guy is. And that method is it's an 89-line protocol where you tell the story, you do the exposure part, and when you trigger, they break the state. And then they set up this visual kinesthetic piece. And I got emotional, super triggered. I jumped to a 10 pretty quick, which was uncomfortable because I don't know anybody here. I knew Diego. I think Diego was there, Doc Diego. But very few people did I know. And then he did the break state, and which is a really cool tool too, by the way, which you probably could use with your storytelling work. I had developed a little bit of rapport with the trainer, and I'm a Ford truck guy, right? I drive a 2013 Ford Raptor. I love Fords. Crazy, I don't know. But when I got triggered, he looks at me and he goes, "Hey, what color's your Dodge truck?" And I looked at him, I'm like, "Dodge? I wouldn't get caught dead driving a Dodge." Next thing you know, I'm out of the memory and I'm on something different. I'm not feeling the. I was like, "Oh, that was kind of weird." And then we did the piece, the visual kinesthetic, the disconnect of the emotion part. And he goes, "All right, now tell the story again." And I told the story again, and I'm waiting for the shoe to drop, and I'm not feeling the trauma trigger. And I stopped. I got through the whole story with no emotional connection. And I looked at him and I was like, "Bro, what kind of Jedi stuff is this?"
Yeah.
Half the class is laughing, half the class is crying because it was a real world combat related trauma, just dissolved. And that took probably about an hour, maybe 45 minutes. And then the sleep hits. And I'm like, why is this not available to everybody?
So let's back up, because talk to us for a second about trauma.
Yeah.
As you're thinking about this, in your terms, or as you explain it to first responders and veterans, and what is trauma?
So a traumatic event occurs, or a critical event for law enforcement or firefighter, paramedic. Critical incident happens, and the fight or flight response, the amygdala opens up. That's the spidey senses on the back of the head, and it glues all the information to the memory. And it's a preservation tool, which is why when I heard the thump in the distance, even though there was a 5-year gap, it went right back to that first one that tells you red alert, right? It's like an emergency alarm button.
And it overrides everything.
It goes into what's called a limbic hijack at that point. So I use the metaphor of an engine, right? Your brain is the engine to the whole body, right? It runs everything. There's a conscious part of the brain and an unconscious part of the brain. Trauma is all going to be locked into the unconscious part of the brain. So when you're driving a car, trauma occurs and you hit the gas pedal.
Right.
Your 1,000 RPM regulated brain jumps up to 7,500 RPMs. You either haul ass through it, haul ass away from it, or the engine seizes in the midst of it. Fight, flight, or freeze. And then your foot gets stuck on the gas pedal.
Okay.
That's what trauma is. Your nervous system gets stuck pegged. And anything that sounds, looks, or feels like the event that happened that caused it activates your nervous system.
And it's just looping.
It's a negative feedback loop.
Yeah.
So like guys would come home from Iraq and on trash day, they're swerving to miss garbage cans.
Yeah.
because that's where they would place the IEDs.
So they take you through this, and this is like a neuro-linguistic type process. What's actually happening in that protocol? Because I mean, folks are watching this right now, and they're, like you did, they're rolling their eyes. Some of them maybe, some of them have experienced and believe in it. But what's actually occurring here?
So, whenever you think about a memory, you're remembering the last time you remembered it. And anytime you activate a memory, something in it changes. Kind of like if you have a brother and sister that live at home together, they have two different experiences, right? And like one will be like, well, I don't remember life being like that. Well, that's because emotions got in the way for the other person. So what's happening is they're associating you into the moment, because when your nervous system is active, when the trigger's active, it's malleable. You can change something in that moment that will change how your brain codes that memory. So there's a really cool part. You're making images, black and white pictures, before and after the event. They call them bookends, right? So when, maybe my first bookend is flying to Afghanistan.
Okay.
And maybe my second bookend is boots on the ground back home.
Okay.
Two safe moments, and you make black and white pictures of that. So in the RTM, you're telling the narrative, the story, and then they stop you, and then they set up that bookend. It's rooted in neuro-linguistic programming. So NLP's been around since the 70s and the 80s. It was stuff that was developed for a phobia cure.
Okay.
So what RTM is, it's like CBT, like cognitive behavior therapy, with NLP in the middle and ending with cognitive therapy.
So when you say reconsolidation is that memory then kind of filing away back into the brain when you sleep? Is that what's happening?
Yeah. So the term is neuroplasticity.
Yep.
Right. And neuroplasticity happens when we finally sleep. So when you shut down that nervous system, you interrupt that pattern of the trigger. A lot of people will go into sleep, and I've had people text me, dude, what kind of voodoo is this? I've slept 13 hours last night.
Yeah.
That's because your brain's been fighting.
And these are folks that haven't been sleeping.
They haven't been sleeping. I had one guy, he says, I haven't slept more than 2 hours in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And literally, absolutely just turned off the nervous system. And then what happens is the REM sleep cycles, the rapid eye movement, is the brain's way of reconsolidating memories.
Okay.
So it's moving the memories to the appropriate place in the brain. So it's taking the emotion out of that memory, and it's moving the image to the other filing cabinet.
So you still have the memory, because I know that when I've talked to some folks, they're afraid of like losing that memory, because they feel like they need to hold on to that memory for, they don't want to dishonor, the moment or the memory or the folks that they didn't make it home. So you're not losing the memory, you're losing like the white hot emotional attachment to the memory. Is that accurate?
You're losing the emotional association to the memory.
Yeah.
So you're disassociating the emotion.
Yeah.
You're not you're not moving, the memory is there. It's your history. Right. It allows you to own the story versus the story owning you.
I love that. I love that phrase. I mean, I've always loved that phrase, and I think it's a binary choice that we have in our life, isn't it? We can either own our story or our story can own us. What happened with you when you said, what's this Jedi stuff you're playing on me? What happened next?
Well, I had a physiological response. I could feel it, like almost like a euphoric sensation, and then just get really calm. And I remember talking with Dr. Burke, and I'll be forever grateful for that guy, for the paradigm shift that he brought into my world. And I'm like, why is this not available to everybody?
Yeah.
And then you realize, because you're a paradigm shift, three things have to happen for major acceptance, right? First is ridicule. So I imagine Dr. Burke gets ridiculed by his peers, or did back in the beginning. And then there comes opposition, right? Yeah. Big Pharma is going to lose money. Yeah. Right. And then becomes the radical acceptance. So you got to get it into the collective consciousness of people. Once more people see it, hear it, it literally transforms the collective mindset on it.
Have you seen, so there's a couple of questions that just come up on this. So that was your experience. You slept that night, and was there a profound shift in your life?
Major shift in my life. So when I got back to Florida, there was 3 therapists from Orlando that got certified. And I'm like, do you guys take TRICARE? They said, yeah. So one of the ladies, she was an Air Force veteran, Cindy was her name. And I'm like, hey, I want to schedule, because I had a lot. Now that I knew that how quickly the brain could download it, I'm like, I want to do some sessions with you. I think I made like 10 appointments with her. And then after the third one, I'm like, Yeah, I think I'm going to have to cancel the rest because I was feeling so much better and not understanding fully. Life shifted, right? So, but you know, you had alluded to, I do run hot. I run fast. Like
Yeah.
I'm that infantry guy stacked on the door, ready to hit the next objective.
Yeah.
I
run that way too.
Yeah. One of my buddies, he's a retired lieutenant. He's a Chinook pilot. He was on the board originally. And he's like, Jarvis, you're like a knife fight in a phone booth.
Yeah. I told a dude one time, he was a Delta guy, and I just commented on how hard he ran. And he said, sir, I'm like a great white. If I stop swimming, I die.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like.
You know, I think for me too, though, once I had that profound shift, I was like, I wanted this available to everybody. Right.
So it wasn't necessarily you were running from something now.
Mm-mm.
It was running towards it. Yeah, I agree with that. And I've had similar experiences. I guess my question to you would be, you asked about why isn't this available? I'll ask the hard question. I mean, I see a lot of, man, in this field, I'm just going to be candid, in the nonprofit mental health space, particularly for veterans, and when you start getting into the mental stuff, that's a knife fight in a telephone booth. Like it is so cutthroat, so tribal. The clinical positioning that happens, and then because you're doing peer-to-peer stuff now, like you're getting interested in a peer-to-peer approach. And I know that hasn't happened yet, but is that a factor? Like the fact that there's just so much kind of just churn within that community? So
in the mental health, the professional world, all right. In America, there's between 9 and 11 million people clinically diagnosed with PTSD.
Wow.
Right?
300 million people in the country, 340, 9 to 11.
9 to 11 are diagnosed, which means there's probably double to triple that have never been diagnosed.
Yeah.
And
because it's not reserved for first responders or
no.
It's not unique to them. Trauma is a universal singular.
We don't hold the patent to it, that's for sure.
That's right.
Matter of fact, some of the worst traumatic stories that I've heard was civilians.
Agreed.
And like and a lot of civilians will compare their trauma to mine. And I'll shut them down quickly. I'm like, look, you can't do that.
Yeah. What happened to me is nothing like what happened to you.
Exactly.
It's like, dude, no, stop. Like, don't do that.
Trauma is an extremely subjective experience. So it's
what's
unique.
Personal is universal.
Totally. So I tell people, I said, look, if something traumatic happened to you and you rate the intensity 0 to 10 like a 10, but mine's a 7, yours is subjectively worse than my experience, right?
Yeah.
So it gives them validation that, hey, it's okay. I mean, yeah, we pack our trauma into periods of time in combat. So, and let's look at first responders, right? There's a study that in a 30-year career, a first responder, a police officer specifically, will be involved with 188 traumatic events.
Wow.
2, 3 on the civilian counterpart, right? So now you know why Florida retirement system has high risk for first responders, because you don't live as long.
But we were talking about this last night at dinner when you and I and Perk were sitting down, and we were talking about how, because you've lived both worlds. Mm-hmm. You've lived the law enforcement world. You've also lived the combat infantryman world with multiple tours of combat. And you were talking about how did you explain it? Like and I'm not minimizing what combat troops do, but you go over, you do the deal, you come home, and even though the amygdala may not know that you're home, you are home.
Right.
Whereas with law enforcement, EMTs, firefighters, you're always in it. Give that river analogy that you gave. I thought that was very helpful. The rapids.
Yeah. So for people to be healed of trauma, they need to be out of it, right?
Yeah.
Because we could do the work with them and we could shut that pathway off briefly. Yeah. It's like pulling them out of a class 4, class 5 river. They're swimming upstream. They're exhausted, right? You give them a break, and then when you throw them back into the river, they get tired again.
Okay.
Right? So, and that's really designed for like ongoing trauma. First responders are a little different because there's always an endpoint to the event because they're all different events.
Yeah.
That would be more akin to somebody that's going through divorce.
Okay.
Somebody who's going through domestic violence and still in it. Somebody's in a relationship with a narcissist. Whatever that is. If it's an ongoing, they can get relief, but then they're going to go right back into it.
Yeah, right? because they're living it.
They're living in it.
Yeah. So I want to bring it back to, it's just fascinating. Like, so you, at some point though, you looked at the landscape, because I think you and I actually talked about this down by the river one day, where you were talking about how, sounds like a Saturday Night Live skit.
Yeah.
you were talking about how the peer-to-peer approach, really seemed, because it's a problem of such magnitude,
Right.
that how are you ever going to get in front of this without some kind of, it shouldn't be just reserved for clinicians. Can you talk about that, and how did you arrive at that, and what did that lead to for you?
So back in the beginning with Dr. Burke, I wanted to do peer training, right?
Yeah.
Because the most important part of the process of healing is rapport with whoever's guiding that session. And
Wow. I mean, that's pretty profound, dude.
it's the most important
But
part.
no one ever talks about that shit.
I teach that in my classes. I said, look, rapport is the most important part.
Human connection, man. That's what make a human connection first. I don't give a damn what you're doing. If you don't have a human connection, whatever your agenda is half-ass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, which is why the peer support is I call it the open flank. It's the wide open flank of healing our men and women who serve a purpose greater than self, right? Because I have walked a beat as a cop. I've done car chases, foot chases. I've had to go hands-on. I've had to discharge a firearm, and I've done combat. Car chases, not car. Well, actually, we did in Iraq. We did chase some guys, more of a Humvee chase.
Yeah.
I've experienced it. I've lived it. So when I connect with somebody, and I'll give you one story. It's phenomenal. We had it's sad to say, we had a suicide from our battalion from Alaska.
Yeah.
We have a closed Facebook group for the Legionnaires. And this was a guy that I worked with.
Yeah.
Bronze Star with Valor, V device, just, and he was a tanker, right? And he ended up coming up to the 3 shop, and he was real big into mechanics. So we knew each other, right? We talked every day. And then when he left, and then I heard he was struggling, I reached out to him. I'm like, hey man, we can help you with this. And he says, nah, I've got a new social worker at the VA. I'm kind of doing that thing. I'm okay. I said, bro, promise me if you get to that point,
Yeah.
And he did, and then he didn't.
Yeah.
And the next thing I hear, he's dead.
Yeah.
Family left, wife left with kids.
Yeah.
His whole world disintegrated.
Yeah. Common story.
Common story.
Yes, sir.
And I did a video on the Facebook group. And I said, hey, this doesn't have to be your end. There's solutions out there.
Yeah.
And then the day after I posted that, I get a phone call from the guy, from one of the sergeants. He was a sergeant, and he left the spot. He was E6, left the E4.
Wow.
So he's sitting there, and he calls me. He goes, I'm sitting here with a 45 in one hand and a bottle of Tito's in the other. I'm trying to figure out which one to go to. I'm like, bro, put the 45 down, enjoy the Tito's, and then let's talk. And I made the mistake of explaining the science of what we do. And he's like, I'm going to be honest, that sounds ridiculous, right? Knowing what I know, if I would have taken another position, it would have driven the wedge. I'm like, ridiculous? I'm like, bro, this stuff is crazy. I have no idea how it works, but it is ridiculous. But it works. And then I knew his story. So he didn't know I knew his story.
Yeah.
He got railroaded by command.
Yeah.
And I told his story back to him.
Yeah.
And one of the best ways to get rapport is to find a common enemy.
Common enemies, man. And the other thing too is, I think it was Mark Twain that said, it's one of the sweetest sounds. I don't know if it was Twain or not, but hearing your name said out loud.
Yep.
I think the only thing better than that is if you can tell someone's story better than they do.
Well, I knew his story very in depth,
Yeah.
and I shared it back with him, and he was shocked that I knew that much about him.
Yeah.
And then, and I took his position because I wanted to keep the rapport going. And then he goes, do you do it? Do you do the process? I said, I do. He goes, I'll only do it with you. Cool, bro.
Take it.
Let's do it. But I said, but first things first, I need you sober.
Yeah.
And he's like, dude, I haven't been sober in a decade. I said, going to work, coming off of work, lunch break, whatever it is, I'll stop what I'm doing. 2 days later, he's like, it was like 7:30 in the morning. He calls me because I just got off work. Let's roll. We did a 2-hour session, right? And his scores were high, like really, really high. We did 1 2-hour session. We went through every traumatic experience of his past, all the negative emotions, basically hit a hard reset.
Yeah.
And then I didn't hear from him the next day, and I'm worried. I'm like, dude, what's going on? And then he text messages me, bro, I love you, man. He says, you need anything, I'm your guy.
Yeah.
But my ex-wife wants to know what you did with the other guy, basically.
Wow.
Because he shifted and transformed, and then got his relationship with his kids back.
Yeah.
He's functioning. He's no longer having to drink to sleep. And I have story after story after story.
I know you do. And
after story.
It's insane how cool that is. How did you evolve into the actual, position to where you were certified and able to do that? Because I mean, I know that's the first barrier people throw up is, well, is he a clinician? How many letters does he have after his name? Like, so I want to, can you just address that and speak to that? Because I think it's important.
No, it's a great question because me, I'm hard-headed, right? And when I originally...
Really? When did that start? Is that new?
At birth. It's the stubborn Irish in me, I guess.
Right on.
So I asked Dr. Burke, I says, I want to train a group of peer coaches to do RTM. And he says, you're not a clinician, you can't. And I'm like, there's got to be a way around that. So me being the cop in Florida, I go to the Florida State statute and I just start looking for the law, the letter of the law. And then I'm like, there it is. There's a loophole. Like, as a nonprofit or a church, you can actually counsel without a license as long as you do two things. You don't tell them your license and you don't charge them a fee. That's it. So I took that to Dr. Burke and then he said, wow, you can do that. And he had his legal team said, yeah, absolutely. So we did our first peer support was in RTM. And that was December of 2019.
I mean, that was a pretty big move for him to do that, too.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, seriously, like, I mean, I step back and I think about that and I think that's a pretty straight up move.
Well, no, because you got to look at it from a professional psychology perspective. They're licensed.
Yeah.
What the license allows them to do is counsel and bill insurance.
Yeah.
And take a fee for the service. That's what the license protects them for. And it's a good thing that we have that, right?
Yeah.
Because you want
For
professionals doing it. But the states recognize the value of peer support, right? So like a police department can have their own peer support program, and they're actually talking out their problems with other cops or with other firefighters, which is more of the cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
We do is not even close to that, right?
Yeah.
We just diffuse the emotion.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, you still have the rapport, the connection, and the miles run, like you and Mr. Abel, you guys have lived it.
Yep.
But there's a real process happening as well. And oversight, like, do you guys have like clinical oversight? How does that work? Like, how do you stay, in the lane of advanced developments and as things change over time and just in staying in tune with all of that, like on the clinical side, do you stay connected to that or?
Well, I'm lucky. I'm connected to a clinical psychologist, neuroscience guy, and he kind of guides the mentorship part.
Yeah.
So when we showed him what we did, he was shocked.
Yeah.
Right. He's the Body Keep Score, Dr. Bessel Vandercook.
Yeah.
He lectures with that guy. So he's colleagues at high levels, and he actually drove up to Maryland to do a brain scan on a female cop because he wanted to see what was going on, just like I did. We had Dr. Bequee with us, who was a doctor of psychology, made the connection, and he did a brain scan for a female cop, 42-year-old female police officer.
Yeah.
And her scores were maxed, 85 out of 85 for PTSD on the PCLC, and she was 27 out of 27 for depression on the Patient Health Questionnaire version 9. So every day is a struggle, like a real honest struggle for her. And then I never forget him because he looked at her because now we call them the invisible wounds, right? Yeah. We can now see them wounds. He looked at her brain scan and said, young lady, this is probably the worst brain scan that I've ever seen. And he said, and I work with MARSOC, active duty Marines special operations guys. And he said, your scores match your brain scan. And she's like, the relief in her voice, I've tried telling everybody that, right? And then I did a session with her immediately after that first brain scan. I came back and did one more session the next morning, and then Dr. Hagedorn did a second brain scan. And then when he finally sent us the report, he's like, this is profound. He said, you're doing in 24 hours what it would take 6 months for an EMDR master practitioner to achieve. And he says, most of them won't even get that level of work. And he goes, and you're not even a clinician.
I asked you last night, I said, if people do what you ask them to do in this and they apply it, what do you tell people is the percentage of recovering from PTS? What's the likelihood that they will overcome the trauma and emerge with that profound change?
So that's a great question, and it's a question that really surprises a lot of people. if you're able to do the work and do the visuals the way we instruct it, and there's no other issues going on, like if it's just PTSD or PTSI, everybody heals. Your brain is that powerful. All we're doing, and I tell it, you're driving a car, all we're doing is holding a roadmap, right? Because the hero in the journey is the person that's struggling. Yeah. We're just the guide that popped along.
What's actually happening with that roadmap? Like, is there a rewiring of the brain? Is that?
It's a rewiring of the brain where your frequencies in your brain are actually changing. Yeah. The electricity, because that's what Dr. Hagedorn's stuff, it tests frequency. So there's an exercise where you're wearing the EEG cap, and then you just sit there for 5 minutes with your eyes closed. Well, what happens when you close your eyes in an unfamiliar environment? Your body goes into an involuntary fight or flight response, and then the whole backside of the brain lights up. That's where the amygdala is. So it's literally firing hot back here because now they're going into a fight or flight response. Okay. Right. So what you're doing is you're shutting down that limbic hijack. You're letting the brain go from parasympathetic fight or flight, or from sympathetic fight or flight to parasympathetic rest and digest.
What type of resistance have you hit on this?
Well, the resistance is typically the higher the level of the academic pedigree, the more resistance, right? The higher, like Dr. Bequee, when he came down to our Sumter County Sheriff's Office training, and he watched the sessions unfold with Sergeant Joe, and then feeling it. The next day he comes in and he goes, "Can I talk to everybody?" He's Australian. He's a cool dude. He's like, he looks right at me. He goes, "I only came here to prove you were full of shit." Yeah. And he says, "I've got initials before my name. I've got initials after my name. I've got the best training that the system offers for trauma." And he said, "My profession can't even touch this because he goes, this is threatening. It's threatening to the profession." But he loved it because, he was a soldier and he was a cop, right? So he loves the aspect.
Lived it.
He's lived it. Yeah. And he sends us people, and Dr. Hagedorn still sends us people.
Well, I noted it, as you continued to evolve this, I would watch how you would take this approach into, just like I said, the darkest corners where it really lived. Because you and I talked about this, like for you, it was important to show in the roughest places, which I've always, that's so SF-esque, to me, is to get in there where it's just the toughest, right, and be the practitioner, a practitioner of this, where a lot of folks just, there's no hope. Nobody goes there like what you did in Western North Carolina, and one of the things that I'll just say, and I just want to say it, is over the years, whenever, because of the nature of my work as a storyteller, a catalyst, doing a lot of advocacy work for veterans with our nonprofit, I'll come across men and women, first responders, veterans, family members who are really in it. And all I have to do is send you a text. And similar to what happened in Western North Carolina right after that hurricane, where I was talking to the pastor from, that ministers to my family and my friends, I sent you a text, and within like 3 fucking hours, you were moving. You and Abel were heading to Western North Carolina. And I personally appreciate the fact that you do that. And I know a lot of other people do too, because it's changed their lives. What has that been like? Taking because I know you face the resistance with this thing, but at the same time, you haven't let that stop you. You're getting out there responsibly serving as a practitioner in the toughest areas. What has that been like? What kind of comes to mind for you when you think about those events? Like when you've worked with the Ground Zero first responders and Ground Zero survivors. Like what comes to mind, and what's that experience been like in the places in between?
Majority of the people that we do assist quickly is usually remote work, because we get people from all over the country. I love the quick reaction force, the QRF. That's one of the things I've always wanted. Mass event happens, mass casualty, whether it's terrorism, whether it's natural disaster. I love to be able to go in and share. Find a better way and share it. Share what we were able to do. And to make massive change. Like when we went up to North Carolina, just one of the guys in the class was an old Navy vet, was the brother of the pastor, and just watching him shift made that whole trip worth it. One life.
And you guys do it remote too, which is astounding. You actually, my dad had been through his own trauma with 3 bouts with cancer and a stroke and just personal shit. And you guys got on a call with, and I was like his caregiver, right? So I'm there with him and down here in Florida, and for the first time, and I don't know how long, he slept. I literally sat there and watched that old man sleep, right after working with you guys. And and it was remote.
That's the parasympathetic rest and digest. You allow the foot to come off the gas pedal.
Yeah.
Because he's been running hot for so long.
Yeah.
And it allows them to sleep and hit that REM cycle and reconsolidate the memories. That's the healing part.
So is the VA or anybody, looking at this and rolling with it? Like, what are you seeing right now?
Resistance.
Yeah.
Specifically from the VA.
Institutional resistance.
Oh, man. It's like institutional. Like, and I'll give you an example. We applied for it was the Mission Daybreak grant. It was a $3 million opportunity. They were trying to find ways to prevent, the problem. We have a solution. Dr. Hagedorn can actually identify somebody suicidal just from his device. Yeah. The EEG will light up a very specific part of the brain. He was rejected first round. We were rejected first round. And the winner of the award does forensic audits. They're already dead, right? I did a session, and then I made a comment on one of the posts, and a VA doc commented on it. And next thing you know, we're in a tug of war.
Yeah.
And one of our coaches actually met with him, and I told the guy, I said, "Look, he deals with inpatient substance use and PTSD." I said, "I will fly to Houston on my dime, on my time, and I will sit down with one of your worst clients, and I will show you the process."
Did he take you up on it?
Heck no. And then he started attacking.
Yeah.
That's that second phase.
Yeah.
Who are you to do this kind of stuff? I'm the doctor, and then multiple times that's that conversation. And usually it's like PhD level or higher.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of a who are you to be doing this? Yep. But yet it's a problem that's so complex and so wicked that a bottom-up solution is really necessary. It doesn't mean that the top-down isn't needed too.
Right.
It is.
It is.
Right? But you would think that a private-public kind of approach would be appropriate. We're seeing the same thing actually on the terrorism front, where so many of our veterans from the GWAT jumped in the fray during the Afghanistan collapse, and 4 years later are still on the phone with a lot of very highly vetted sources, right? So they have a lot of information, but the institutions roll their eyes and they say, who are a bunch of old GWAT folks to know what's actually happening with terrorism? What the Taliban are telling us about the terrorists is much more accurate. It's like, what planet are we on here? And so the VA's not. Now, you mentioned also, though, a study that you guys are pursuing. And by the way, institutionally, organizationally, you've moved on from 22-0 and Healing the Hero.
Yep, that's
the new.
Yep. So Healing the Hero, we're actually a Christian faith-based ministry, but we work with anybody. Yeah. We just tell people on the front end, hey, if this isn't for you, just say, I want to go through the secular approach. And the process that we're doing right now versus RTM is 89 lines. We're at a 9-line. We have a 9-line protocol that from line 1 to line 9, you can zero out of trauma. It takes about 4 to 6 minutes per person.
And how many iterations have you done with this problem? Just swag.
I've worked with at least 4,000 people myself.
And what's the success rate been?
I've only had one person who I would say there's a handful of people, but I think there's some secondary issues. We do find people in what's called the cluster B, which is like borderline narcissism, who are resistant. Yeah, because there's a benefit
to being resistant.
Yeah, there's a benefit to their trauma.
Oh, gotcha.
It's called secondary gain.
Okay,
and we do run into secondary gain once in a while, but for anybody that comes to us that wants to do it, everybody heals.
And you guys are doing some work now to demonstrate this at scale.
Yep.
Academically, so that you can, I guess that allows you to kind of move into the passing lane and really, because your mission, Jerry Lujan would be proud to find a better way and share it. Like that really is your thing.
Yeah, I've always looked for better ways of doing things.
Yeah.
All right, and so like the study we're going to do is Arizona State University.
Okay.
They're really big into law enforcement, but we're going to do. I would say I've got at least 30 done right now, 30 brain scans. And then we're doing the sessions with those 30 people. And they're either vets or cops or firefighters or paramedics.
Okay.
So that's the cluster that's in that group. So what we're able to do is do their brain scans on the front and back end, and then do 3 to 5 sessions with each of them to validate scientifically. So we're basically going to use a scientific method. We're going to use the system against itself.
Right. And you do a lot of work with first responders, veterans, but you and I were talking about last night at dinner how, you also work with people that have grief, extreme anger. Why is that?
Well, trauma is just one part of the problem.
Yeah.
All right. There's a lot of unhealthy negative emotions. I mean, you can see people road raging.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I want to see change in a law enforcement culture.
Right.
Because when somebody gets triggered, we escalate, right? And de-escalation is the big term. How do you de-escalate? So if we can shut down the triggers on the law enforcement side and the suspect goes up and this guy stays right here, there's nowhere for this guy to go but back down.
Yeah.
So it de-escalates the situation.
Because we mirror each other.
We do.
You know, we're social creatures. We mirror each other. It's contagious.
Yep.
So you've added a category we talked about last night that speaks to high arousal of emotions because of recent events. And what's the category that you've added?
Politics. We treat politics as a negative emotion.
I think you should. I mean, we talk about it on here all the time.
Yeah. What you reject gets your energy, right? What that means is, and your unconscious brain can't process negatives. So when I say don't think of a pink elephant, what's the first thing you thought of?
I just thought of a pink elephant.
Thought of a pink elephant because the brain can't process the negative unconsciously. So whenever you're telling yourself, don't be so angry, what is your brain actually hearing?
I'm pissed.
Be angry.
Yeah.
And it's activating those emotions. So politics, there's a lot of visceral emotion around politics where you can associate them into a moment, a political moment, or anything, and they feel it, a visceral response.
Yeah.
And we can diffuse those triggers as well. And what that does is takes the control away from who's triggering you.
We need to unpack this because this is really important. What are you seeing, first of all, because you work with so many people? I mean, clearly to add politics as a category to defuse. What are you seeing? Like, what's happening to people right now in their relationship to political issues, and how is it affecting their agency and their autonomy?
So politics divides households.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a liberal and a conservative in a household, there could be division there.
Right.
It could end marriages.
Yeah.
It could keep families from coming together, or it'll allow lifelong friends to disengage.
Yep.
All because of the visceral emotional connection to politics.
Yeah.
And that's intentional.
Yeah. I call that behavior, and I know it's not don't say it, Colin. Colin says it's a word for art. That's bullshit. This is our word. It's divisionist behavior. It is. I believe the leaders who do that are divisionists. 100%. Like they are practicing divisionism, and we've even given it like a working definition. And divisionism in this sense is the act of fomenting division between in-groups and out-groups in order to pursue a short-term agenda that's in your best interest, or a small group's agenda. You know what I mean? And everybody else becomes the out-group. And that is not only is that a primal tribal response, but it's friggin' insidious for leaders who are supposed to be bridging, you know, because in a liberal democracy or a constitutional republic,
right,
the social capital that holds that together, out of many come one, is supposed to be bridging. You're supposed to bridge, you know, the group is not at the epicenter like you see in a tribal society, it's the individual. And what we're seeing at our level is that this primal response of fear and anger around politics is actually so ancient and so primal that a lot of these leaders, they know that. And they know that rather than taking the effort to bridge and bring in groups and out groups together, it's much easier to just foment that instability and put people into a trance-like state, where the person across from you, as Sebastian Younger says, you treat with the contempt normally reserved for one's enemy.
Right.
Are you seeing that, like when you engage at a practitioner level? So
we kind of mitigate what we receive on the session. So I typically don't let people go into details. Like to heal, we don't want to know what happened to them. It's not necessary. But it's just the nature of humanity, right? If you go back, you go back into the history books, the creation of, public relations and propaganda were the same person, right? Edward Bernays. He was the nephew to the one psychiatrist that was really big back in the day.
Freud.
He was Freud's nephew. So he took his uncle's research and created this public relations. And that's what governments use, which becomes tactical psyops, right?
Yeah.
We do psyops on our enemies. We're doing psyops in our media.
Yeah.
And that's creating a lot of those in groups, out groups, so that collective, whoever that one group is, like, let's look at the war in Ukraine, right?
Right.
Do we really need to be supporting the loss of over 1 million people? But yet there are powers that be, whether it's General Dynamics, Raytheon, somebody wants that, going on because somebody's able to sell, equipment and hardware. But so we divide our people, right?
Yeah.
We divide people on a political level because everybody gets emotional. What happens when you get emotional?
And it happens on both sides of the aisle.
Both
like
sides.
Nobody is clean on this,
No,
my
nobody.
opinion. Like this is I think the divisionist behavior is, and so. But my thing is, as citizens, as neighbors, as moms and dads, one of the things that I think we've got to really get adamant about is we've got to start calling out that bad behavior, and we've got to start reclaiming our own agency. And so, like, by adding this as a category, what are you enabling someone to do who maybe is jammed up with the political outcomes of what? Because when that happens, as Dr. Ivan Tyrrell says, anger makes you stupid.
Yep.
In other words, that capability that you would normally have for connection and collaboration, you're in survival mode.
Right. And the interesting part about that is, and this is what we teach people, when you go into limbic brain, your amygdala takes over, you shut off your prefrontal cortex.
Yep, it's not working.
And that's where your decision making is, and that's also where your empathy center is.
I mean, it's the same override you talked about earlier in the interview, right? But now it's an inappropriate response to what should be political discourse,
right?
Civil discourse.
To something that was probably connected decades ago.
And most of the time we're being played.
Yeah.
And so so there is, for someone that's actually been like jammed up by the political process and can't get past it, this would actually help them.
Yeah. It would help them drop the neural pathway connecting to politics, which then it's not getting your energy anymore. It's no longer a rejection.
And leadership is the management of energy.
Mm-hmm.
Where we apply our energy is where we put our focus, right?
Exactly.
So what are you most excited about, Dan, when you think about where you're heading? What are you most excited about with Healing the Hero and the work that you guys are doing?
I'm excited to get the studies out so that we can shut down the naysayers.
What should we expect on that? Is there any kind of...
Arizona State, we signed a 2-year contract, but we were going to do 30. I've already done, inside of 2 months, we're already done with the first 30 brain scans. So once I get the second scans done, we're going to send out the data. And then I'll probably keep sending data until they say stop. But I'm excited about that because that's going to... We don't want it to be an us versus them with the clinical world. They need to understand they're operating in a program. We all operate in a program. Their program is they're trained in a box, and we're so far outside that box. We're not going to take all their clients from them in any way because we can't. Healing the Hero 22-0, none, even collectively, we can't do it on our own. With 1 million vets out there, it would take years and years to get through. So we need them. And the only way we're going to get their buy-in is to do the research.
Do you not think it's time that for some of these wicked problems like this, that we need a paradigm shift just in how we collaborate on the private-public side? Getting out of this institutional hubris to think that you're like the only one that can solve the problem, yet you're failing miserably because of the scope and magnitude of the problem. Right. Like you can't handle it. You need, and we're not talking about reckless renegades.
Right.
We're talking about responsible practitioners doing peer-to-peer work. Because again, look at what happened in Western North Carolina. Look at how Global War on Terror veterans went into the fray when institutional leadership fell short. Look at the Afghanistan withdrawal with groups like Sacred Promise and Pineapple Express. I mean, it is clearly an emerging trend in the world that we live in today of complexity that this bottom-up grassroots application is not going away.
Yeah, no, grassroots is where it's all happening. That's where the real tangible, the meat and the potatoes are coming from.
Yeah. Can I ask you? I want to ask you just one more question to contemplate, and maybe I'd just like to get your perspective on it. And it is a hypothetical. Okay, but just knowing your understanding of trauma, knowing your understanding of terrorism and the problem set as a law enforcement officer, I don't know if you saw it, I had Doron Kadar on from, he was an IDF operator, special operator, and he, one of the things that we're concerned about is the reemergence of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and them conducting a homeland attack in the United States. At a magnitude that would dwarf 9/11. In fact, it would look more like October 7.
Right.
And multiple sources independently obtained are saying 1,000 highly trained operatives in the United States now because of the open borders and other things with that mission to do and where we live, work, and play, right? And so one of the things that we're trying to look at is a similar thing, like, with the trauma, but episodically. If you were to have, let's say, an October 7 style series of complex attacks across 8 cities, but at the level that it was applied in Israel on October 7, what are we just thinking about Western North Carolina, and what are we looking at in terms of scope and scale of trauma, and what should we be thinking about now? Not Chicken Little kind of stuff, but like, is that even a problem or concern? And if so, what should we be thinking about now left of bang?
So, one, understanding what trauma actually is going to be a big help. A lot of us don't fully understand it because we code it as children and we improperly code it as adults. Left of bang is what Dr. Bequee works on with his tactical presilience, where we're right of bang. I mean, it's oh shit, it's already happened, right?
Yeah.
If you take 9/11, for example, 9/11 affected the entire world.
Yeah.
Right. And just by watching those repeated events and feeling those visceral emotions, there's a lot of people who probably still have post-traumatic stress from 9/11 today that might have lived in Idaho.
Okay.
So if you see something at a larger scale, it's going to affect everybody because there's something called vicarious trauma. Like you can actually give PTS, like a cop's wife or husband could develop post-traumatic stress because their spouse got into a shootout.
Yeah.
And all that emotion attaches to it.
Not only that, with our Gathering Storm research and the book that we're going to put out, we studied other case studies. The Bedlin school siege by the Chechens, the Crocus City Music Hall in Russia, and what we saw was, and then of course October 7, where body cameras and then uploading the footage in real time and broadcasting it to the rest of the viewing audience of like unreal levels of interpersonal violence that we can't even fathom. Right. You add in the fact of suicide bombings that we've never seen in the United States, dudes and dudettes that are willing to fight to the death, you correct me if I'm wrong, but most law enforcement responses are to one shooter, maybe, and so you start to add all those in, horrific levels of trauma inflicted on children and women. And I'm like, how would we even deal with that when we can't deal with what we got right now?
Yeah, we're not prepared for that. Our law enforcement's not prepared. I always, I've been a cop, and cops aren't always the best on the pistol, right? Most cops have rifles, and they're better at rifle shooting than pistol shooting, but a 12-man ODA team could take over an entire city.
Yeah. And in fact, in Mumbai, 10 terrorists held Mumbai, a city of 19 million people, in lockdown for 10 days. And hundreds of casualties, right, inflicted. And these were highly trained dudes. And a lot of folks speculate that it was a predecessor to this level of attack that bin Laden hatched in 2006. Right. Look at the D.C. snipers.
Yep.
2 dudes out of the back of a car locked down the Beltway. And again, just with your experience with trauma, I think it's something that, is there anything on the front end that communities, law enforcement could do now to maybe start thinking about that or preparing for something? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a terror attack, but mass trauma.
Yeah. I don't think law enforcement is going to be the ones kind of handling that. It's probably going to be handled at a state level.
Yeah, community level.
Community level. Kind of like when Marjorie Stoneman Douglas happened with the shooting down in Fort Lauderdale. Yeah. The state came in and just threw money at, and the sad part is our stigma to trauma, to mental health. There were parents down there that wouldn't even let their children talk to therapists. Right. And they've had at least one suicide of a kid that was involved, that was a victim of the event. And that's really why we're rushing to try to get some evidence base behind what we're doing, so we can get the system to change its way of looking at trauma. Because I look at it, trauma is easy to heal, right? The cognitive work that therapists do, that's the hard stuff. We can break the old bad patterns, and then now they need to develop new, better patterns. And that's where therapy is really beneficial.
Almost like there could be a private-public relationship here.
Right. And like what we do at Healing the Hero, like we work with cops, firefighters, paramedics, Gold Star families, White Star families. We work with their spouses, their kids. if you put a uniform on at one point and you don't even have to be active, that's who our audience is.
So talk to me about that as we close. Someone's watching this who either has a loved one going through it, a service member, first responder, a military family member, or active duty, reserve guard, and they're experiencing some of, if they located themselves in the stories that we've talked about here, what should they do?
They could go to healingthehero.org website, and there's a blue button that says Heal Here. Click that button. It'll go to our case manager, and she'll communicate with them very shortly. And oftentimes you're connected with a peer coach in less than 24 hours.
Is there a cost associated with that? How does that work?
No, there's no paywall, there's no insurance, there's no EAP, there's nothing. If you're a vet, a family of a vet, or first responder family, it's all covered.
Well, I know that you and Abel and others put so much of your own effort into this. Yep. How can people help you do this?
Well, obviously, you run a nonprofit. Finances is a big part of it. And there's a lot of competition in that space.
Yeah.
We're looking, all we need is one angel. If we get one angel, we could literally fund, and I've told people $15 million, we would fix PTSD in America.
I will tell people, look, if you're a potential donor, okay, and you're thinking about this, I as a donor to what Dan and his folks do, we supported them going up to Western North Carolina at a time when it was just awful. Mm-hmm. Not that it's not now, but it was awful. And then I went up there and spent time with Pastor Glenda and the community and drove around. And I will tell you, this was months later, through tears, she's telling me the impact that you had, not on just her, not just on her brother, the first responders, the community, and the long-term resilience that community is still employing all these months later, as the rest of the world's moved on. And what we invested in you guys going there, man, it was a rounding error compared to what you guys bring to the table. Exponential ROI on human impact.
The beautiful thing is we've got the skills to train people. So like when we went in on the second go run, first time we went in, we did an analysis, worked with the pastors. They were interested. We went the second time and we trained 11 of them to do what we do.
Yeah.
Right. So the train the trainer model is we train them. So now Pastor Glenda can sit down with one of her church members and do the process with them, or her brother can do the process with somebody. And it was funny because Glenda's husband, well, he messaged me like the day or two after the training. He said, I was at the deli. This guy was super triggered. And I said, hey, man, do you want to, because I use the term, do you want to break up with that emotion? And he said the guy looked at him like he was crazy. But then he got his number and he did a session with him. And he says, dude, what kind of voodoo stuff is that? Guy's anger got turned off.
Yeah.
What does that do collectively?
What's that worth to you? What's it worth to that individual? One thing I'd like you to maybe think about it, we don't have to answer it here, but if communities are thinking about building community resilience, because if you think about like even East Palestine, Ohio, the train wreck and the chemical, I went there and did some work, and it was a extremely collectively traumatic event that little town never in their wildest dream expected to see. The folks on I think it was the Caddo River in Arkansas, where just a flood came through and wiped people out in the middle of the night in a campground. If a community wants to work with Healing the Hero to build community resilience and this train the trainer, can they do that left of the event? Is there a way to work with your organization on that? So
they can prepare the objective before it hits.
Yeah.
Right? So we could go in, we could go in and we can do the training. And then once word starts getting out, it's going to be a massive shift.
So they could hit the blue button on that one too. Mm-hmm. Okay.
They can hit the blue button. Just reach out and connect with us, and then we can talk about what that looks like. Because I recently just started a group called No Fear or Fear Not at my church, right? Yeah. So my goal is to train people to do what I do and replace me and step back.
Yeah.
And the Healing the Hero wants to partner with as many churches as we can.
Right.
So we can actually train some of your veterans, and then they can just go local.
But I will say, and because he won't say it, is like if you do a collective community thing like that, I would look at how you can support that organization. Yeah. Because they'll just do it, because they put so much good into the world. We got to make sure that we keep you guys with the airspeed that you need to keep going. So before we close, Tell me about Maze,
So-
this lady at your feet here.
For an hour and 50 some odd minutes, she's just been relaxed and
She's
chill.
just been chilled the whole time.
So Maze is a service dog. She's
Yeah.
a crossbreed German Shepherd, Belgian Malinois. She came out of Chicago. There was a young veteran that I was mentoring a few years ago. He was a Navy vet. He was a CB, did a tour in Iraq. Got addicted to opiates because the VA was really good at pushing pills.
Yeah.
And was in a very ongoing traumatic event. I did a lot of work with him, and he was doing really well. And then he got married to somebody that was narcissistic and was then in the class 5 rapids all the time.
Yeah.
And we tried to get him out, and we couldn't get him out. And he locked her out of the room. Jared Hill was his name. And then he took his own life. So I picked her up at his funeral, and I get to be the service human. So
That's amazing. And we got to hang out with her last night at the house, and I don't mean to brag, but she followed me everywhere.
Everywhere.
It might have had something to do with the food that I was prepping, but that is just one of the coolest dogs I've ever seen, man. And so, Dan, what have we not covered? I mean, we've run it. I really appreciate you going into your backstory. I know that brings up a lot for you, but it meant, because I think it's so important to see the way that you run now is fueled by those miles. What have we not covered today? When you think about the challenges that are out there with where people are mentally and things they're going through and what the system does, and what it tells them, what have we not covered that you want to make sure that you leave people with before we close this out?
I would say, to understand how trauma works, you talk a lot about the make sense mandate of the brain. Right?
Yeah.
So if the brain doesn't have the proper context, it's going to add the context. And oftentimes we add the wrong context.
Yeah.
Right. So what we're able to do is go back and add new context.
New patterns.
New patterns. Right.
Yeah.
And I'll just leave you with one story. Probably the most precious session I ever worked with. Guy's name is Mel. He was a World War II veteran. He's now 101 years old. He's still alive.
Wow.
And he was like, "Do you ever think it's really gone?" I was like, "What's that, Mel?" PTSD, because he went through the RTM protocol.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, what are you feeling, Mel?" He said, "I felt guilty every day I've set foot on U.S. soil because so many good men didn't come home." I'm like, "Whoa, that's survivor guilt, Mel. I know that one very well, and that's an 800-pound gorilla." So the exercise with him was a reframe, and I said, "All right." His best friend, he was a B-17 waist gunner, and his last combat mission was flying over Normandy on D-Day. So you can imagine what this guy's seen. Incredible, just a legend. And I said, all right, his best friend, Oscar, was shot down in a B-17 off his flank. They used to wave at each other, like bros would. He would always pull Oscar out of the bars because he'd get into bar fights. The old stories. And I said, all right, Mel, I want you to trade places. You're now on Oscar's plane. He's on yours. You're going to watch him fly away, and he's going to survive.
Yeah.
What do you want for his life? And then he came up with all these. I would want him to be happy, live a great life, be a productive citizen, which you don't hear that anymore. And just have a wonderful experience at life. I said, do you want him to carry the weight of your death for the rest of his life?
Yeah.
Heavens no, I would never want that. And then I just asked a question. So what makes you think he's expecting less from you?
Yeah.
And it was like, his eyes got really wide, and he looked at me. He goes, I never thought of that. So he got the new context he needed to let the emotion go.
And is there anything wrong with us asking that question to a peer? Did you need to be a clinician to ask that question? I mean, honestly.
No.
But yet we've been conditioned to think that that's the case, and it's something like that. I mean, thank God you were able to ask that question, man. Because, just asking those kind of questions and letting someone reframe. Powerful stuff, bro.
Survivor guilt, I'm always trading places.
Yeah, I love it. That's really great.
So,
Dan, thank you, man. Thank you for what you've done, what you continue to do, what all your team does. I know they do so much behind the scenes. What I can promise you is we'll continue to tell your story here. You always have a place in that chair whenever something new is happening. I've asked you to maybe come back after the study is out and released. But hopefully you'll come back and share some stuff with us as you continue to run the seams.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I know there's probably going to be a lot of response to this podcast. And if you want to be part of the solution, reach out to Healing the Hero. We train coaches every other month, and we need you.
There it is, man. I think we'll leave it right there. Listen, thanks everybody for watching this powerful session of the Scott Mann Podcast, and we're grateful to you for being here. If you found this helpful, if this could serve somebody, share it with them, man. This is all about human connection. That's what this podcast is about. And that's how Dan and I met, and that's what it's been for us. You know, the relationship is the asset, and so share it with somebody. If you would leave us a review, that would sure mean a lot. And let's keep getting this subscription up at a grassroots level, because this is where human connection lives. So until next time, thanks for what you do, and we'll see you on the rooftop.